As you'll probably know already, I think cruise missiles are brilliant. Not only do they save a lot of lives because one can keep soldiers out of harm's way, but they're tactically advantageous. It means that one can basically keep equipment that's better used in other situations intact, ready to go, well maintained. And this can have an enormous impact on strategically important positions and strategy overall because it allows one to maintain this equipment and save lives. Very positive thing. As you'll also know, I'm a big fan of the Storm Shadow missile, the bunker-busting sledgehammer, yet there is something new in the works. Something better. And only time will tell how much better it will be, but that thing is the Perseus multi-role cruise missile. And let me tell you, it may be called Perseus, but it's far better than the Greek hero. It doesn't just decapitate Gorgons, it obliterates them. Thrice, at high speed, and can operate at such a range you'll never need to use reflective surfaces to find the target again. This is big. It doesn't just mean that there's going to be a sort of replacement of the Anglo-French Storm Shadow, but it means that anti-ship missiles that the UK and France uses, for the French that's Exocet as well as SCALP, which is a Storm Shadow variation, and for the UK Harpoon, they're all going to be replaced. It replaces Storm Shadow, SCALP, Harpoon, likely the Taurus eventually, and the Exocet, meaning it's hugely versatile and it's going to be massively useful in a lot of different conflicts. Back in the day, the UK had the option, okay? They knew they were going to develop a new, basically future weapons system, a new future cruise missile. They had an option to bridge the gap, and this is the reason I'm talking about it now. They knew they were developing this new weapon system, and they knew that Harpoon, which is the UK's current anti-ship main missile, they knew it was going to come out of service in 2023, and Perseus was slated for about 2035 coming into service. Now, of course, during that period, you need something in the interim. That's a pretty long interim to be without anything, and that leaves the UK vulnerable. Now, the UK had a lot of options that it was considering, and I won't run you through it because it was a pretty complicated process. But in short, they could either buy the LRASM by Lockheed, I think, the Naval Strike Missile, the RBS-15, I think that's the upgraded version, the Mark III, which is powerful, with better digital interface, or it could buy French upgraded Exocets, or they could just upgrade Harpoons beyond Block 2+. Long story short, Perseus has been brought forward to at least 2030, and many speculate it's going to come before that, because as of yet, the UK has no real interim plan. Harpoon has always been slated to leave service in 2023, yet, of course, there have been issues around finding a replacement, finding something to fill in that gap. And it seems that the Navy is pretty much for bringing this forward, because I think it was the first Sea Lord said back in, was it 2018 maybe, that if we were to find a replacement, something that would be viable from the list I basically said a minute ago, in short, it wouldn't be ready until 2026, and it would be pretty short-lived, and it would be really, really expensive with only a modest impact. And so what's the answer? Well, many are speculating that Christmas is basically going to come early, that Perseus might come. It might be ready prior to its due date. Years prior to its due date. Now, of course, this is just speculation. There's no current plan saying, any of this. But let's say that scenario came to pass. Prematurity might not be the worst thing ever. And of course, I'll talk about that in another video. But let's say Perseus did come. What would the reality look like? Well, first we've got to actually know what Perseus is. So first off, as you can probably guess, it's an Anglo-French collaboration, and as you can probably guess from that, it's produced by MBDA, which is sort of Europe's best missile manufacturer. This project, labelled the Future Cruise Anti-Ship Weapon, has been in development for a while, and it will feature a number of pretty notable upgrades from the Harpoon, Storm Shadow, the Exocet, all of those really. SCALP. Something to bear in mind is that it will replace Anglo-French anti-ship missiles, and so it will have to take out ships. But in addition, it's going to replace the sort of conventional land attack cruise missile. Not Tomahawk, we don't know. It might replace some Tomahawk units for more viable short-range strikes, but we don't know. In any case, so it's got to fulfill sort of anti-ship capability as well as land strike capability. And so what this means is it's entirely replacing the SCALP, it's entirely replacing Storm Shadow, it's entirely replacing the Exocet likely, and Harpoon as well. And that means it's really adept in taking out ships. That means it's really adept in taking out static structures, as Storm Shadow was. It has huge penetrative ability. And also, it can attack, because of its high speed, sort of non-static defenses, missile launchers, that sort of thing. It can efficiently deal with time-sensitive targets because it is incredibly fast. And that's where we start. The first thing to note about Perseus is that it's a supersonic cruise missile, potentially even hypersonic. Now, supersonic cruise missiles have only really been implemented to great effect by India and Russia's BrahMos, the world's fastest cruise missile. Yet, a number of nations are developing this supersonic or hypersonic technology in order to make supersonic or hypersonic cruise missiles, and to make them more effective, more impactful. Hypersonic, I believe, is at least 5 times the speed of sound. Now, we don't know specifically how fast Perseus is going to be. Estimates are at around Mach 3. But potentially, as it's upgraded, we'll see hypersonic cruise missiles coming in above Mach 5, which makes it ridiculously fast. Ridiculously fast. And the way it's going to, build up this speed is through, of course, a ramjet engine, because one can't do it through traditional turbofan, meaning it basically utilizes excellent continuous detonation wave engines, and that makes it highly compact. And that's important because it has a smaller engine, meaning it can have a smaller airframe than most cruise missiles. And because of this, it can travel faster, and it can maintain a lower profile. It maximizes stealth. Now, this is important because not only can it travel faster and hit these sort of non-static varied targets before they move too much, but it being quick and agile and being able to strike targets 300 kilometers away in a matter of minutes means that it's less likely to get hit, and a successful strike is more likely, particularly on these defenses which likely are oriented to defend against these sorts of missiles. Perseus may also have differential variants that come out as time passes. As I've said, it's slated for 2030, but likely we'll see more additions, more variations coming out in the future, just as Storm Shadow had in SCALP and Harpoon had as it was upgraded in blocks. Now, in regard to the specifications, we don't know much because it's a future weapon system, but it's likely to be about 5 meters long, have a weight of around 800 kilograms. Now, something interesting about its weight is that its warhead makes up a sizable portion of its weight, considering how fast it goes, considering how much is needed for fuel, how much is needed for the engine. It doesn't just have a single warhead, unlike Harpoon or Exocet. Perseus will split into 3 munitions, submunitions, or auxiliary munitions, once it reaches its target. Now, this is important because it has the ramjet which powers it, which will sort of power the main central component, and then there'll be 2 lateral submunitions which come out and can strike a target as well. Now, this can be oriented in a few ways. Either they can remain as an integral group, so there'll be, a single munition which it sort of travels together in, at which it reaches the target, and then 2 can potentially split off. It can remain together, which gives it this sort of bunker-busting, really powerful capability. Or it can split off, as I've said, into these 3 munitions. Now, this is important because it means it can either strike hard targets on land, these sort of targets that Storm Shadow might have hit in the past, that are really tough, that require a large explosive blast, that require a lot of penetration. But it also means that it can strike a single ship at multiple points, or multiple vessels simultaneously if you have 1 vessel and then 2 vessels beside it. Now, this is important because that's a lot of power. So not only can it split into 3 potentially, and there is the option to do this, it means that it's configurable in the best way possible. It doesn't require changes. It's all electronic, changing from this 3 munition orientation, the multiple strike orientation, to this, bunker busting, huge power single munition orientation. And that's a lot of power, but of course it's also versatile in what it can be launched from, not only in its strike package, so it can be launched from submarines, surface ships, carrier-based platforms, maritime patrol aircraft. And that's why largely it can fulfill the role that Storm Shadow, that Exocet, that Harpoon, that SCALP do. And that's important. Now, not only does it have huge versatility in what it can do in its terminal phase, it has huge versatility in what it can be deployed from. But what this likely tells us is that if it's this versatile at an early stage, it's going to be really rather effective, really rather versatile in actually adapting to these platforms in an early stage. This versatility isn't something that's going to have to be developed, like, let's say, the Nerbe missile, where they've had to, I guess you'd say, develop certain air capabilities. If you have this in the original package, it means that synergy can be created early, that strategy can be planned to greater effect, that, in effect, as you use these sort of different platforms in unison, using the same munition, you can build up that order of operation that maximizes the strategic capability of a military. And that's important. Now, we've established so far that it's fast, it's hard-hitting in multiple facets. It's a great munition, but not only does it have to actually, pack punches, but it's got to avoid the punches being thrown at it, and that's avoiding sort of enemy anti-missile systems, AA systems. As I've mentioned before, it has this compact ramjet, which reduces its size already, and it's going to have reduced heat signature anyway because of this smaller ramjet, which makes it harder to find on IR, but generally, it implements a smaller airframe. It has a lower cross-section for anything that might want to shoot it down. It has a lower radar cross-section. It utilizes advanced stealth materials in order to build the shell. And that's really important because, given its orientation, it's going to be either sea skimming or high altitude. It can maintain stealthy for nearly the entirety of its sort of mid-stage guidance, meaning that the enemy simply cannot see it coming. Perseus will be incredibly effective in stealth, in impact, and in speed, which means it's virtually impossible to properly predict when it's going to come and build air defenses around combating it. Now, Perseus, in regard to actually finding its target, beyond being stealthy, beyond being powerful, beyond being fast, finds its target really, really well. It will use a dual-mode sensor, which is a combination of AESA, so an active electronically scanned array, which is, I guess, the best way to describe it. It's like a more compact version of that big bull radar you see on top of the Type 45, and it's going to use that for active radar homing. Now, the active scanning feature of the missile itself, of Perseus, it will use a synthetic aperture, and what that means is, a bit difficult to explain. There's an aperture which sort of moves to and fro, meaning it can create a better three-dimensional image of the target, of the landscape. That means it has better sea skimming capability. That means that it has better targeting capability as well, and it can be more precise. And in this, it utilizes Doppler beam sharpening. Now, this is where there's perhaps more blunt waves used with the laser, and that means that sensors can create images, I would assume a bit like the Doppler effect, dependent on how the light actually comes back on the reflection, dependent on what it particularly hits, in order to build up a more three-dimensional image, as I've said, and in order to create images which can better show the landscape, better show the topography of the area based upon the missile's own movement, based upon the way waves are reflected back, based upon, I guess, the sort of redshift. It's a bit difficult explaining it. I can't explain it too well. Ask your local physicist. Anyway, it's got LiDAR or LiDAR as well. Now, what that is that's laser radar. That will allow it to gain even better surface picture. And this is important because it bridges the gap between mid-course guidance, which is of course this radar, the active array, and the terminal semi-active laser guidance if that's designed to be used. All in all, it can see the terrain far better, it can differentiate and see the targets far, far better for target recognition, and if you're in a hurry, it can use the semi-active laser guidance for more time-sensitive targeting. Now, in addition to this, in addition to it being fast, powerful, potentially multi-strike, very versatile in launch platform, versatile in target, it will also basically be able to be programmed, as it were, or reprogrammed during mid-stage guidance. So unlike Storm Shadow, it can change target during mid-guidance, and it utilizes satellite aids for this. And more than this, of course, satellites will aid it on its initial guidance to the target. Perseus is planned to have 2 modes of attack, of course. So it will have this land attack mode, which I've said, and the maritime attack mode, because it's both a cruise missile for land attack and maritime strike. The land attack will travel at high altitude, then drop down for strike as sort of as you see a lot of missiles doing in the pop-up, and this gives it huge penetrative power, and considering its initial speed, traveling supersonic, potentially even hypersonic, it will probably be even more impactful than Storm Shadow. Now in maritime mode, it uses mid-stage sea skimming, of course, which means that it can travel as low as possible, which is just as good as traveling as high as possible to avoid enemy radar. And then it will use a sort of pop-up and strike. So it will travel really close along the water in order to maintain stealth, and as naval missiles often do, it will pop up before performing its strike. Now, to give you guys a picture of how effective this is, considering the speed of the munition, the low profile for the majority of its mid-stage, and the terminal stage 2, for both modes, for both the land attack mode, in which it travels at high altitude, and the sea skimming mode, the maritime mode, at which it travels at low altitude, the enemy apparently would have an estimated 3 seconds to respond to Perseus incoming after being detected and before impact. 3 seconds. I don't even know that I could turn around that quickly. For missiles, that's near impossible. For anti-munition, sort of CWIS, that's really, really difficult. So for any anti-missile missiles, that's, near impossible. For CWIS systems, that's really, really tricky. And even for laser systems, that's particularly difficult, because they, do need some targeting time, particularly if submunitions deploy, and you don't just have one munition striking the target. Now, if this wasn't enough, if this didn't make it good enough already, once it reaches the terminal stage, as I've said, it will either combine into this larger, heavier, more impactful warhead of 300 kilograms, or split into the 200 kilogram main munition and the 50 kilogram submunitions, or effectors from these lateral bays. Once these submunitions split, they'll use inertial guidance systems through effector systems, which makes them even harder to target. It means that one can't necessarily track the lasers, the radar, that sort of stuff. There is very little that one can do to actually stop Perseus once it is there. And effectively it means it's, really tricky to actually prevent impact once it is detected. Now this is important. Perseus is not only brilliant in general sensor, but it's all-weather. Far more than any current munitions. It can operate under any environment. And this means that in the terminal phase, it's going to have more precision than ever. And even for submunition deployment, even if it's partial inertial navigation in the terminal stage, it's going to be particularly accurate, striking at weak points in ships, which means that the submunitions, despite their smaller size, about as heavy as a brimstone, which is still damn, impactful, they're going to be able to be even more precise and have better effect on target as they target weak points. So Perseus is exciting, in my view. If we're to go over what makes it so great, it's fast. It has a pretty great range, which it can reach very, very quickly, of course. It can launch off multiple, really a load of potential platforms. It has different modes of strike. It has different munitions it can deploy. It has excellent sensors. It can travel a lot further using mid-stage guidance and maintain stealth for longer, and that's even just what I'm counting. So it's just really exciting stuff, I think. Perseus is coming. Be ready.